Welcome to our study on the Apocalypse. Today, this is episode number 22. We'll be dealing with chapter 19, which is the city of man. For those of you that have requested the PDF file and wonder why it has not yet been sent to you or why you haven't received it, it is because I'm having trouble with my internet connection for my email on my computer. I was unaware of this, and for the last week, a little over less than a week, maybe a full week, but at least since last Tuesday or Wednesday, all of the emails I thought that I sent out didn't go. And so while we're letting the geeks figure that out and tell me what I need to do or fix it for us, I will get you your PDF file just as quickly as I possibly am able to communicate with you again. We are today discussing the city of man. Revelation chapter 21 speaks of a new heaven and a new earth. And verse 2 says, "Then I, John, saw the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." The city of man versus the New Jerusalem. You see, if there is a new city coming, we have to consider why. What's wrong with our cities, or what's implied by the coming of a new city and a new Jerusalem? The remaining 25 verses of this chapter, chapter 21, are all about this holy city, the New Jerusalem. The final two chapters of the book of Revelation will then draw us further into the revelation and the revealing of the apocalypse and the mystery before us. I need to say this as preparatory, and we've got a lot of material to cover, and we may go a little longer than is normal or typical for us today. In order to understand the chapters that are coming, which will be extremely practical and biblical. We're going to be dealing with, for example, next week, the New Jerusalem, the immigration of Abraham. That's immigration with an E. And then on chapter 21, the New Jerusalem, Abraham, the immigrant with an I. And then we're going to be dealing with the New Jerusalem living in the land of promise, and the New Jerusalem again living in the land of promise, part 1 and part 2. So we're going to be extremely practical and mystagogic in the chapters that follow. But in order to appreciate them experientially and non-academically, it is important for us to consider today, what is the city of man? What is this fallen world in which we live? Moses encountered the presence in the burning bush near the bottom of the mountain. After leaving Egypt, the people met with God at the foot of that mountain. But it was when Moses went up the mountain that he drew near the thick darkness where God was. The risen one did not reveal himself to Luke and Cleopas on the road until the lifting up of the bread when they ate. It was when the apostles ascended to the upper room they experienced the materialized presence of the risen one. Peter, James, and John ascended Mount Tabor, the Mount of Transfiguration, to experience the immateriality of the material one, the one they saw, and the divinity of the human one. They experienced what had been invisibly present, but they had to ascend. Like Thomas a week later, we also must ascend to the upper room if we are to experience the apocalypse beyond the literal surface physical level. It is the revelation being revealed in and by Jesus Christ. You see, we must first cross the plain that leads us to the mountain. We must rise above those foothills if we are to ascend the heights. And so today we are going to do some of that rough climbing of ascending, that we might then enter into the revelation in the weeks that come. That brings us to the question, the need for a new city. The need for a new city is not at first obvious. Now, it is easy to think of simply exchanging one city for another, moving from New York to Boston, or even moving from Oklahoma City to Nuremberg, Germany. However, these are only a change of geography, not a change in city. There would be differences, of course, between New York and Boston, but they would still share so much American identity so that they're not fully different. Moving from Oklahoma City to Nuremberg would involve a change of nations, of nationality and culture, but it's not a change within Western culture. And of course, if I were to move, or you were to move, or we were to move from London or Los Angeles to Tokyo, there would be a change of cultural identity involved in the city. But at its functional, ontological, dare I say, paradigmatic level, all cities are human, man-made realities. Therefore, they all live inside the same identity of being a human, man-made system of living. The need for a change of cities in the apocalypse is not exchanging one human city for another. It is an ontological change of worlds, an exchange of living in a human empirical world to living in a divine mystagogic world. In other words, when we're going to be using the word city, it's a metaphor, a euphemism for living in a man-made world, a man-made system within our physical world. To enter the revelation of the New Jerusalem, it is necessary to step out of our empirical world and to see and consider our world from the outside rather than from the inside? Can we step outside of our human created identity world and look at it from a different perspective rather than from inside? Of course, it is difficult for any of us to step outside ourselves and to see ourselves as others see us. This is not only true personally, but collectively as well. It is hard for a group to step outside itself and to see itself and its dynamic the way others, not in that group, see them. For example, if our collective identity is a political party, we have difficulty stepping outside that political identity to understand it from the outside. If our collective identity is racial, we find it almost impossible to step outside our racial experience of life. Or if our identity is tied into being national and our nationality, it's also extremely difficult to step outside our national history and our historically shaped national identity to see ourselves as other nations see us, as other nations see those of us in the United States. And I know that we have many people from around the globe watching these videos, and I never mean to imply looking only at the gospel of Jesus Christ from any kind of political or cultural identity that I might have, because I know all of us on this planet have our one for whatever world we are in. Of course, the greatest challenge of all is stepping outside our self-understanding of the self-contained supremacy of thinking itself, the supremacy of human rationality. We think, therefore we are, and all other things that are outside that thinking rationality are inferior to our human ability to think. Any other way of knowing is automatically inferior. These parochial, collective, it's a group, ways of viewing and defining life are understood biblically as Babylon. Babylon would be the term used in the Bible for these world systems, which are the collective thinking and living ways we express ourselves. When we are inside a human system, there is no vantage point from which to discount the pretensions of the system, and no vantage point from which to defy the demonic or any malignant power that is claimed by that system to be the truth, whether it be a political movement, racial, national, or ideological dominance of others. These man-made cities, collections that we can belong to, have no source of moral insight beyond the partial and the particular. Beyond the partial and particular collective identity of that group. That which is a way that we always are inclined to set a premature limit. Every group has a boundary, a limit preconceived to its understanding of truth. At what point is it possible for a person to step outside of himself, herself, outside his group, his political party, his club, his fraternity, his sorority, and in an act of human freedom, transcend outside that identities, transcend it, both his community and to transcend the whole historical process that has created and defines how he or she thinks. Wow, I know that's abstract. The issue of a new city that is here in the apocalypse causes us to enter the fullness of human transcendence as we consider the free will of the individual against the collective will thinking of the city, of our club, our group, our sports team, etc., whatever that is. There is our own free will versus the will imposed on us by an identity. Inside the group, inside the clique, inside the city, there is always tension between an individualism, which makes the individual his own end, it's all about me, and a collectivism, the group, which regards the community as the end and goal and the purpose of the individual in the first place. It takes a village. To speak of the meaning of life in any ultimate way requires us to step outside our parochial, collective way of viewing life. In today's chapter and in those which will follow, we will seek to transcend our cities and our collective way of thinking. Such transcendence can be painful as we turn loose of collective urban identities and loyalties and enter the promise of a new Jerusalem. In what follows, we must remember we are not speaking politically, ethnically, or nationalistically. We are stepping outside of these cities and competing cities inside this human world. St. Maximus the Confessor says that there are many people who will confess the crucifixion and even embrace personal sacrifice in their own lives, but are resistant and refuse to embrace the resurrection and to live and experience the resurrection life, in their own living. We are being asked with a new Jerusalem to enter into a resurrected life, enter into the empowering presence of the resurrected one in our lives and in the living of our lives. That is what we're talking about. Putting it in religious terms, we are not talking about human politics, human races, rationality, etc., etc. We are talking about stepping into the New Jerusalem. We are not partisans inside any city. In order to enter the New Jerusalem, we will have to depart from the cities in which we now live. We must transcend our personal politics. We must transcend our ethnicity. We must transcend our nationalities. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female. We are all one in Christ. The universality of God is universal and is not dependent upon anyone's group to which we belong, to which we identify with. It is by transcending and from the perspective of being outside these cities that we are able to see the whole picture, the whole of history, of our own particular political or ethnic and national identity, the history of that, and of all such identities for that matter, as a flux of time. If we look at the history of our own group, it's got a movement of time. Only a consciousness which transcends time can define and circumscribe, encapsulate the flux of time. Meaning, if we don't get outside of ourselves, we're just now. And we think this is how it's always been and always ought to be. Or if you get out of it, you realize that there's a history of how we got to where we are, and that this history is a period, a part of that larger thing that we call time, that there has been a fluctuation in it, that our country, for example, is not identical with what it was 15, 20, 30, 100 years ago or whatever, for example. You see, it is by stepping outside our own lives and our own history, that is by standing outside of the times in which we live, that we are able to gain the perspective of eternity. Far enough back, you see 1700s, 1800s, 19th, the 20th century. Here's where we are today. You see pieces of time in the mosaic. It is by standing outside of the pieces that we gain the perspective, from the perspective of eternity, by which we can see the changing partiality amid the pieces of time, the changing values inside pieces of time. From the perspective of eternity, we realize that the values and opinions of each age, of each collective piece of time, those values, those opinions were relative to and within those people living at that particular age, in that particular era, and within that particular piece of time. If we can see that, then it gives us pause to realize that our human values and opinions at any moment in our particular time are not absolute. Human perspectives are always partial and shaped by the history of that moment in time. That's the human system. That's the human city. That's what we have to step out of in order to see it, understand it, and realize why there is a new Jerusalem and why we must leave the old in order to enter the new. Two trees, two cities, and two kingdoms. The history of mankind is the history of two trees, two kingdoms, and two cities. The two trees is the choice of human identity, the choice of our personal identity, whether we are iconic or idolic, like we've talked about in the last sessions. Are we made in the image of a creator for the purpose of being a living icon? Or are we us, our own creator, creating out of us who we think we are? Question of identity. We have discussed the two trees at length in our series, Paradise Has Two Trees, and we will not repeat that here. The two kingdoms are the two Weltanschauungs, the two different worldviews, the choice of whose kingdom it is that we live in, the kingdom of God or the kingdom of mankind. The two cities are the choice of the structure and relationship of the parts to the whole. One city is how mankind organizes itself into social, economic, and political structures, Babylon or Jerusalem. The history of mankind is the Neolithic history of our species. You see that Neolithic history began with the domestication of animals and crops. The name of that first farmer is Adam, the only name historically that exists for our first farmer. The domestication of animals created nomadic herders following their herds as they grazed. The domestication of crops, planting and harvesting, created a stable, predictable food supply, both for animals and humans. the cultivation of the land, the planting, the growing, harvesting of crops, created a stationary population. A stationary population led to a change in housing from portable tents to more permanent housings, an increasing staple food supply lessened the mortality rate, created a workforce which exceeded that necessary for farming, which in turn led to the birth of cities that structured and organized humanity socially, economically, morally, and governmentally. We have previously discussed this Neolithic formula and Neolithic progression from nomad to farmer to city dweller in these things, I believe. And we're just not going to take the time. I've got some of it mentioned again there, but let me avoid that or skip on for the sake of time. The biblical account is that history of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, nomadic people, moving from Adam, the first farmer, the nomads becoming city dwellers and creating their kingdoms. Whether or not one accepts the biblical account as being directed by a creator is separate from that historical account that undergirds the entire story. That journey of a species from nomad to farmer to urbanite. In addition to this Neolithic story, that biblical story also contains the ontological, existential understanding of the two trees, the two kingdoms, and the two cities. So it's all there in this biblical account. If we step outside of it and see the huge panorama landscape of human history and humanity that is being demonstrated there. This formula, nomad, farmer, urbanite, is iconic. It reveals something to us. That formula takes us from Adam to Abraham to the city of God, the New Jerusalem. Adam, Abraham, the New Jerusalem. Genesis, Abraham, the book of Revelation. Genesis begins with nomads domesticating animals and crops. Revelation ends with mankind living in the holy city, the New Jerusalem. You see, the point is this: the crowning material achievement of mankind is a human city. The crowning goal of created humanity is also a city, the city indwelt by God. It's the goal of both. A city, either a man-made city or the city of God. Well, now let's discuss Mesopotamian cities. Biblically, two different cities known as Babylon and Jerusalem, are the most named cities in the Bible. The name Babylon is found 297 times, while Jerusalem is found over 1,000 times. The first human cities were created in Mesopotamia. Enoch was the founder of the first city of the first civilization. The name Enoch is the Semitic Hanuk for founder. In Sumerian, his name is Unuk, and from his name, the city Unuk, Iraq gets its name, and it is from the Sumerian form of this name of Enoch, Uruk, that the modern day Iraq gets its name. It's the same name, 10,000 years later? It was in Iraq that cities and civilizations were founded. Beginning from the 5th millennium, Eridu, all the way to Babylon, which lasted until the first few centuries of the era, the invention of cities may well be the most enduring legacies of Mesopotamia. That would have been there over 5,000 years of cities in Mesopotamia. Of course, we still have them there today. 7,000 years ago, urban living began in the cities of Mesopotamia. I said 10,000 a while ago, 7,000. In addition to the historical memory of Enoch being transmitted in the names Uruk and Iraq, another historical memory is embedded in Genesis. Now Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch, and he built a city. The Mesopotamian civilizations of later centuries elevated Enoch and the mighty men of that primeval age who followed him. They elevated them in their memory to the status of gods, whom they call the Anunnaki, or Ununa, the founders of urban life, urban civilizations. The ancients deemed these mortal humans to be gods because they were the founders of cities and the creators of civilizations. So, cities, it's something the descendants of Cain created. Enoch. What are civilizations? We're just having to get a grasp if we step outside of this and see huge chunks of time and history. Now, most of us, of course, do not think in terms of culture and civilizations. Our thinking and our self-definition for all of us is much more parochial, family, high school, city, state, nation. Thinking in terms of civilization requires us to step outside ourselves, to think gigantically larger than ourselves, and to observe ourselves within a matrix, a worldview, and a system of thinking and living that has been carried on over centuries, if not millennia. What do we mean when we talk of a civilization? A civilization is a cultural identity. Villages, regions, ethnic groups, nationalities, religious groups all have distinctive cultures at different levels of some sort of cultural heterogeneity. All of those subgroups work together to create a larger heterogeneity of a culture. The culture of a village in southern Italy may be different from that of a village in northern Italy, but both then would share in a common Italian culture that distinguishes them, say, from a German village. European communities, in turn, will share cultural features that distinguish them from Arab or Chinese communities. And Arabs, Chinese, and Westerners, however, are not part of any broader cultural identity. These broader identities we call civilization. An Arab civilization is not one larger. The Chinese, Asian civilization, there's not another larger. Westerners, there's not another larger identity. This would be the end of the line identity, short of humanity itself. A civilization is thus the highest level cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of a cultural identity that people have short of being a member of this species. A civilization is defined both by common objective elements such as language. And while we have different languages in the West, there's a common source of the Romance languages and the Germanic languages that give us our variety. A common history shared from which we come. A common religious history going on. Institutions, even political, that create this subjective self-identification of people. People can say, I'm an American, I'm a Canadian, I'm a Brit, I'm German, whatever. I'm a European. I'm an American, meaning, of course, our Canadian friends and our Hispanic friends need to remind us again and again, we're all Americans. You guys are in the United States. We're in the Hispanic countries, and others are in Canada. Differences between civilizations are significant and potential source of conflicts exist between the interaction of civilizations as well as within civilizations when rapid changes occur. You can have a clash for two reasons. One, two different cultures begin to bump, or you have rapid change inside a civilization or culture that is completely redefining all of those features that had been taken culturally for granted for hundreds of years. Conflicts arise. Differences among civilizations are not only real, they are basic. Civilizations are differentiated from each other by history, language, culture, tradition, and most important, religion. The people of different civilizations have different views on the relationship between God and mankind, the individual and the group, the citizen versus the state, parents and their children, the relationship of husbands and wives, as well as differing views on the relative importance of rights, responsibilities, liberty, and authority, equality, as well as hierarchy. These differences are the product of centuries. They do not soon or easily disappear. And if you are living at a moment in history when those things are clashing or changing, it will be an extremely uncomfortable time as one's entire cultural world is being turned upside down and replaced with a different or a new cultural identity and rules of behavior as we live our lives. This is Babylon, the city of mankind, changing cities within Babylon. The historical city of Babylon was located on the plains of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was not the first city of Mesopotamia or the first empire, nor was it necessarily the greatest of all the Mesopotamian empires. It was in the cities of Mesopotamia that the multiplicity and complexity of urban life created the confusion and babel symbolized by the building of the towers of Babel, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. However, Babylon itself became the biblical city of mankind par excellence for being the empire that conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the Israelite temple, and carried the inhabitants captive to Babylon, to Mesopotamia, in 586 BC. The Babylonian captivity was forever immortalized in Psalm 136 in the Septuagint, pain dripping from every word and praying for the bitterness of retaliation and retribution. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Upon the willows in her midst, we hung our musical instruments, for our captors asked us for words from our song. Hey, you Israelites, see your musical instruments, play us a song. And those who carried us off said to us, sing us a song of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand be forgotten. May my tongue be glued to my throat. If I do not prefer Jerusalem in the beginning of my merriment, O Lord, remember the sons of Edom, the captors, on that day in Jerusalem when they were saying, empty it out, even to its foundation. Destroy the temple, destroy, destroy. O wretched daughter of Babylon, blessed is he who shall deal with you as you dealt with us. Blessed is he who shall get the upper hand and dash your infants against the rock. Wow. The lament of those whose culture has been taken captive by a new culture. Only two empires ever conquered Jerusalem, destroyed its temple, and carried the people off as captives. The Babylonians in 586 BC and the Romans in 70 AD. On the physical level, it is no stretch to identify Rome as the great harlot of Babylon. However, let us seek to understand the deeper meaning of the name written on the great harlot's head, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. In paradise, mankind chose to live in a world of his own creation. He created his own world based on his knowledge of good and evil. That is, mankind created a world based on the choices of what he deemed to be good, the best way of achieving oneness and the harmony of community, the best way of becoming one race and one language, the bookends of all humanity, between which is contained the total story of humanity, the huge total 10,000-year-old story is Babel and Babylon. This is mankind's beginning, the Babylon of Mesopotamia, and the Babylon, the great whore of the empirical world. This is mankind's beginning and end. This is the Alpha and Omega of mankind's world without God. Jacques Ellul, a French Protestant who was part of the French resistance against the Nazis during World War II, after the war served as professor of the history and sociology of institutions in the Faculty of Law and Economic Sciences at the University of Bordeaux. In addition to his doctorate in history and sociology, the war prevented his completing the capstone exercise to receive his doctorate also in theology. Ellul published over 50 books, including those which joined a sociological critique with a biblical theological account, including his book, The Meaning of the City. For Ellul, a sign is an event by which spiritual and even eschatological realities become no longer abstract but actual, visible. You're seeing the invisible manifested in an event. The event is then concrete in its effect. It creates a result, an outcome that reveals what was hidden. Elul's understanding of a sign is very close to the iconic understanding of creation. Elul understood the city as a sign of the world's response to God. The light shone in the darkness, but the darkness did not receive it. He came into the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world knew him not. This failure to recognize God's work is present in its purest form in the city. And that is why the city is chosen as a sign of the world's attitude. The judgment pronounced against Babylon is the last judgment. That judgment that takes in the whole world and leaves no position unexamined. When this judgment is pronounced, it is not a question of the state, a society, the country, or the nations, but of Babylon. The last battle is fought in the city of cities, the battle against the world. The victory over the world is a battle cry against the city, a victory over the city. The city of man, mankind's self-created world. Thus, God's judgment of Babylon and the history of his relationship with are for all time the mirror of his relationship with all human cities, because God took Babylon as a sign of all cities. Babylon is called great, the great whore, Rome, because she represents and embodies the abominations inherent in the urban life in the cities built by the peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. The cities have become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, where every unclean wickedness is caged and offered for sale. Man-made kingdoms and the governments of men have drunk her wine and gone to bed with her. Heads of government, heads of state, politicians have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxuries. All of these are citations, by the way, from Elul. You'll have to get the printed manual when it comes out, or the PDF in the meantime, as long as it's available, so you can have these citations for yourself. Babylon's power and wealth and promises of life and opportunity seduce mankind. Babylon is a culture. It is a civilization stretching across centuries and millennia. The particulars of government, from empire to monarchies, dictators, or democracies, may change, but it is the same reality wearing different clothes. Mud brick towers of Babylon are modern buildings of glass and steel that scrape the sky, are differences of material, not of mindset. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top shall reach to heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves and be known as the greatest city on earth. Like the announcer to one comedian used to say as he introduced that late evening comedian on television, quoting the Bible, the greatest city on earth. No matter how good it is compared to other man-made cities, all man-made cities are at heart the same. They define right and wrong. They define the parameters of our thinking. We call it political correctness today. They define the parameters of our social behavior and the creation of economies and the buying and selling of our lives, our labor, and our souls. Those buying and selling the world to us are selling Babylon to us. The buyers and sellers are the great men of the earth. It is their greatness that becomes the sorcery that deceive us. We're not speaking about having a job and working for a company or ourselves. We're talking about that invisible, man-made world system in which we all find ourselves and having to provide a living for ourselves. It's whether or not we are seduced by that city into thinking this is the kingdom. We're not talking about a right-wing, left-wing, no-wing conspiracy. We're outside of that stuff. We are speaking of man-made cultures created after and from having eaten of the tree of death in paradise. This is who we are. This is the world we have created. Babylon cannot help itself. A world without God cannot create a godly world. A world without God cannot create a godly world. Babylon is cursed by its godlessness. The curse was there from the beginning when Adam made his choice. It is part of the city's very being. It is woven into the fabric of her city. The city in its origin is a cursed place by its origin, its structure, its selfish withdrawal, and its search collectively for other gods. As it develops, every city must receive and bear the curse on its own account. Mankind did not set out to create an evil world. The goal was to create our own world, a world we thought better than being part of God's world. As the law says, the city is the product of goodwill. There are none but the well-intentioned in the urban effort. Everyone works to enable man to live better, to give him better homes and leisure activities, to keep his life from being perpetually dreary, to get him to meet others and escape from his solitude, to keep from his eyes his humorless situation, to procure for him better and steadier work. She'll remove him from the rigors of the seasons, the ice storms that we've had this year, to protect him from men who might harm him, our police force, to help, so that he might no longer be subject to the devastation of robbers, that the fruit of his labors might stay with us and be really our own. We build cities to ensure more comfort and what are called the joys of life, with all the guarantees of science, medicine, pharmacology at our doorstep. We build cities to change the powerlessness of him who must watch those he loves die, unable to do a thing, and to enrich him and enable him to say, "Rejoice at last, my soul, for you have great riches." Look how nice your home is. The city is the product not only of man's effort, but even more of his goodwill and good efforts. In the growth of the city, in its demographic accumulation, there is nothing but goodwill. It is not the evil mad scientist of Hollywood films or the evil empire of Star Wars movies which decide the course of a city's history. Rather, it is the engineer's bright eye, the urbanist's broad sweep of mind, the hygienist's idealism that determines its course and shapes the city. We in Oklahoma City are very, very proud of our collective effort to make our city better, more livable, more fun. We've created Bricktown. We've got a NBA team, the Thunder. We've got a farm club, baseball, etc., maybe a soccer team, parks, convention centers. All of this to improve life and benefit us all. All cities are like that. No city is created to become a dungeon. Yet look at the results. Even more slavery in effect, which creation can only make more tolerable. A slavery tolerated in the world in which we now live. Human relations get destroyed in the anonymity of the great city. We don't know the people on the bus, the people passing us on the sidewalk. The radical uncertainty of work, unemployment becoming an urban phenomenon. The homeless, the dispossessed, the helpless, jobless, begging on the corners of our streets. That's in our cities. Found among us because of the contagious and gangrenous growth of the city. Man now subject to man instead of subject to nature. The ravages and uncertainties of modern warfare, attacking cities during an enemy occupation, another fruit of urban civilizations, urban warfare. It is the city that suffers most. And then we have the slums. We replace them by new slums of modern apartment complexes. Such are the results of our goodwill and our best efforts. We can't solve the problem of the city. It is in spite of good intentions, in spite of its goodwill, Babylon cannot escape the curse stamped into its existence. Mankind cannot create a better world than God can. The curse has been there from the beginning. It was stamped into that tree and ingested in the choice to eat therefrom. The fruit from that tree nourishes us and inspires us not to live like God, but to become God. As God created us, likewise we now recreate ourselves. As God created a world, so now we create our own world to live in. It is Adam creating Babylon. Well, this is pretty heavy stuff. We've gone just quite a ways, so why don't we take a quick break, and we'll be back very briefly. This will be a short break. Thanks. Welcome back. I should call attention for those of you that will be having the PDF or the manual that we have a picture there of Adam taking from the Sistine Chapel, Adam creating Babylon. We've had that picture previously where we had the creation of Adam by God, and then we had Adam on both sides, Adam creating himself, and now Adam creating the cities of the world. I am grateful to Reggie Jaime, a member here at St. Elijah, who is good at this kind of creation, these kind of pictures for me, for having developed all of these for use with us. Okay, the wham is in the trap. If you have set out a mouse trap in your home and your grandchildren who are not yet in school come over, you will warn them, now stay away from that trap, it will hurt you. And if they listen to you and ignore the mouse trap, they are safe. But if they ignore you and listen to the mouse trap calling them, then they're going to go touch the trap and wham! Oops, I hope I didn't knock us off the air like I did last week. The trap goes off, smacking their little fingers. Now, does the pain in their fingers come from you? Did you spank their hand to punish them for touching it? Of course not. The wham is in the trap. The pain was in the trap all along. The pain is a consequence inbuilt in the trap. The tree was not a trap set by God to catch humans, the way we set a trap to catch mice. God is not a traffic cop hiding with a radar gun waiting to catch us in a speed trap. God is on our side. He is the only lover of mankind. God was warning Adam that this particular tree was a dangerous tree that held dire consequences inbuilt in it for any human that ate from it. You see, free will comes with consequences because choices have consequences. We were created with free will, and in order to manifest free will is free, and it's got consequences to the choice. The curse is in the tree. Death is in the tree. This is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and Omega of mankind's efforts to be God without God and create a world without God. Babylon the Great is fallen. Babylon always becomes a dwelling place of demons, a container of every foul, unclean, and hated spirit. Babylon was judged before Adam ate from the tree. No matter how bright the lights of mankind's world, darkness lurks in its shadows. Babylon has already been judged, but it is not yet known, just as someone may be condemned in absentia and be unaware they have been judged. And so the powers of the city have already been condemned, but can go right on playing their role, apparently unconstrained, without any knowledge of what has already happened and how they have been judged. Now, I live within Western culture. I am familiar with its history. There are other cultures on this planet, each with their own history. And I am discussing, or will be making use of, Western culture and Western history as an example of how the creation of all man-made identities, cities occur. I'm discussing Western culture because it is what is familiar to me, not because I think Western culture is superior to any other culture. I do not believe any culture is superior to any other culture. I am simply using my own culture as one example of how humanity can build a world without God. Now, it would be easy to point out the horrors of National Socialism in Nazi Germany as an example of such a system, or to point out the godless world of the Soviet communism in Russia and the countries in the Soviet Union. I do not wish to do so. I wish for us in the West to consider our own culture, not because I am anti the West, not because I am somehow angry at the West, or that somehow I am an antagonistic citizen of the United States. I am not. I am born here, and as anyone else, everyone that's born somewhere are grateful to have been born wherever we have been born, and are part of that culture and world. And I am equally part of this culture and this world. But I want to trace some movements in the time we have left about within Western culture and the United States, a history that many of us in the West don't know, partly because it has been omitted from our official teaching and textbooks, though the history is there and well documented. I am not here trying to start any kind of fight with anyone, but simply to suggest to all of us that none of us, including citizens of the United States, can take refuge in our man-made world and our man-made cities and in our man-made partial values of the particular time in which we live. Babylon is judged and has been judged from its beginning. The city in the West, beginning with Augustine's The City of God. The moral values of a culture are one of its fundamental and foundational elements. From the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, giving birth to those urban cultures, the moral values of those cultures were embodied in religions whose deities had given their values to them. For example, the Code of Hammurabi being given by the Mesopotamian sun god Shamash, or the Torah being given by the God of ancient Israel to Moses on Sinai. The survival of urban cultures depended on its uninterrupted food supply coming from the peaceful stability of an agricultural base. The parts of the whole had to work in mutual harmony for the whole to survive. The successful uniting of the social, economic, governmental, and moral elements along with the food supply created cultures lasting hundreds and thousands of years. Civilizations became so large and lasted so long that the unity within them became invisible to those living there. The debate over the role of religion in society and the relationship of religion and government, often expressed currently in terms of the separation of church and state, is a debate within Western Catholic civilization. We have already seen the role religion, particularly emperor worship, played within the Mesopotamian and Roman empires. Domitian did not invent the imperial cult, but he made use of it. He did not invent the Roman religion of the Vestal Virgins, but he enforced its orthodoxy by punishing Vestal Virgins for breaking their vow of chastity. Likewise, Domitian enforced a strict orthodoxy on Judaism by restricting adherence to Jewish ethnicity. Likewise, Constantine did not invent Christianity, but he made use of it to replace the imperial cult as the moral glue of common values uniting the empire together. The inherent unity for a whole to exist existed within the Roman Empire before Constantine, and it continued to exist in the Roman Empire after Constantine. Governmental structure needed something to glue to hold it together. Beginning with Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor had also carried the title Pontifex Maximus. The Roman high priest, thus uniting within himself church and state. As emperor, Constantine also carried the title Pontifex Maximus and used its authority to call the First Ecumenical Council of Christianity to meet in 325 AD. There was at that time a major division within the church. If Christianity was to be the glue of the empire, that glue could not be split without splitting the empire. Constantine did not impose his point of view upon the church. He forced the church to decide the issue. Once decided, Constantine then enforced orthodoxy on the church within his empire. The relationship of the state, the emperor, and the church, Christianity, within the Roman Empire, beginning with Constantine, is called Caesaropapism. Caesar was not a pope. He did not dictate religious doctrine. He was most often a protector of the church, financing and presiding over the ecumenical councils and settling disputes over territorial jurisdiction of bishops, and on occasion even naming and deposing bishops. If he didn't like the bishop of Constantinople, or the Bishop of Constantinople was critical of the emperor or his wife, that bishop would find himself exiled. Beginning with Constantine, the church found itself in uncharted waters, the conversion and Christianization of the Roman Empire. As we have already seen, there was a categorical divide between the eastern end of the empire and the western end. The eastern temperament was existential, internal, and experiential, while the west was empirical, external, and rationalistic. Therefore, the living of the faith on the eastern end of the empire was understood as establishing here on earth a living image of God's government in heaven. Living the faith was becoming a visible embodiment of the invisible. We lived it, and we learned how, and we're beginning to learn how to live, and we lived inside a human governmental system with an emperor. The western end, the Latin Roman end, became a philosophy with dogmatic demands binding upon all. What came to be emphasized inside the Christian tradition in the West were precisely its more exterior, formal, visible, external aspects. And these in the West increasingly were emphasized at the expense of the more esoteric, experiential parts of Christianity. Within a century of Constantine, both ends of the Roman Empire increasingly came under attack from Germanic tribes in the west, the Parthians in the east, and Islam on the south. The survival of the empire and preservation of order and cohesion with the maintenance of external forms became more important than spiritual regeneration of our lives. We needed the visible, making the sign of the cross, visible attendance at church, the visible pledges of allegiance, of patriotism. You need visible signs to act as the glue rather than internal, private piety and visions. The depopulation of Italy, when the capital moved from Rome eastward to Constantinople, accelerated the decline of the Western Empire, increased its vulnerability of being an open invitation for German attack. After the sack of the city of Rome by Alaric in 410, Augustine, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, wrote a defense of Christianity with a social and cultural blueprint, creating within the limits of society and through submission to the discipline of institutions and to a common belief and worship of what amounted to the kingdom of God on earth, conceived as a great city, analogous to the kingdom of God in heaven. The defense of the Western lands required uniting the West into a singular whole with a common religion as its glue. A religion with an overriding and sometimes exclusive stress on the exoteric, external, tradition of Christianity and on a fixed and obligatory dogma. This is what you have to believe. This is what you must believe. The external side of Christianity provided the formal structure through which the imposing, that is, by which the creation of an earthly kingdom could be imposed and the great Christian society realized. This is the creation of Western medieval Europe that we're talking about. Augustine's dogma of original sin. Augustine invented original sin as his simple, easily understood and remembered glue. Original sin. Because of Adam and Eve's sin, all human beings were ever born or to be born are born guilty. Every human being is guilty of the crime committed by Adam and Eve, and therefore likewise must be punished. Only the baptism of the church can remove original sin. Anyone who dies without baptism or who dies without confessing his post-baptismal sins also goes to hell. In Augustine's city, there was no free will. One was not guilty of his own sins. All were guilty of Adam's. Life was reviewed chronologically now. The past, Adam's sin. The present was an opportunity because the future, we were already born going to hell. And in the present, we had the opportunity to get saved, get out of going to hell, go to heaven by externally getting baptized and externally practicing and receiving the sacraments of the church. The common goal was for the city to unite everyone and everyone's efforts into a single common goal, the goal of getting as many in the earthly city into the heavenly city of God. In medieval Europe, the governmental element, the social element, the economic element, and the religious element, and every other human element were united working toward that single common goal of escaping hell by making it into the heavenly city. This is the glue that created medieval Europe. This is the glue that created Western Christianity, Catholic Christianity. This is the glue that created Western Christian civilization, a Catholic civilization. I've got an overview there that I'm not going to read publicly of the stages of Catholic civilization, beginning in 400 A.D. with Augustine's City of God, on through 800, 1054, the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade of 1204, the Italian Renaissance in 1300, Luther and Calvin's Reformation in the 1500s, and the wars inside Europe. And then looking at England in the 1500s, Henry VIII, England going to bed Catholic and as it were waking up Anglican. And the history then of almost 200 years of social, political chaos, religious chaos inside of England, the English Civil War, the deaths of countless adherents on either side of Protestantism, Puritanism, Anglicanism, Catholicism, the takeover of the government by the Puritans, the Puritan protectorate of Cromwell, naming himself the Lord Protector, all of that setting the history at work in which, beginning in 1600 and so, you began to have English citizens pouring out of that strife-torn social chaos, coming to North America and creating the British colonies that eventually would become the United States of America. And among the Puritans that came, the Puritans, by the way, were Calvinists, and the Calvinists were strict followers of Augustine's City of God, as were the Lutherans. The Puritans came, and the night before a group of them embarked the next morning in Massachusetts, Jonathan Winthrop preached his sermon labeled today as the city set on a hill. Arriving on the shores in the Arabella, Winthrop defined the Puritans' purpose of having come to the New World in 1630. His vision was the Puritan vision of Augustine's City of God now being implemented in Massachusetts. His address today is known for its most famous passage, the city set on a hill, sometimes abbreviated the city on a hill. After setting forth the challenge of the necessary things they must accomplish, he declared the ultimate purpose of why God sent them to this new world was to set an example for the rest of the world of what a godly society looked like. God had chosen them to create a city set on a hill, to be an example to the rest of Western Europe what the kingdom of God on earth should look like. After saying that we're going to do this and we'll choose this, he then says, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men elsewhere shall say of succeeding plantations, may the Lord make us like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city set upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us to be their example." The Puritans were Calvinists who believed they had been chosen and predestined by God not only for personal salvation, but for the purpose to show the non-chosen and those not destined for salvation how to live a better life anyway. It was the destiny of the chosen to build a godly world, a godly society, for the benefit of the ungodly, who could never build a good society on their own in which to live. It was the Puritans' duty to build such a city that the rest of mankind would wish they also lived in New England. Armed with Calvin's Reformed theology, the Puritans believed they were the elect chosen by God to reform society. The Puritan dictatorship in Massachusetts did not survive. The belief that America had been chosen by God to show the rest of the world how to live and govern did survive. In 1845, John O'Sullivan, the editor of the New York Democratic Review, endorsed the annexation of Texas using the phrase manifest destiny. It was obvious it was America's God-given right to conquer the continent. In 1848, the United States attacked Mexico in the Mexican-American War and seized the top third of Mexico as its own, divided Oregon Territory with Canada, and the boundaries of what came to be known as the Lower 48 were set, though there were not yet 48 states. The boundaries had been created in 1848 from sea to shining sea. The predestination in Augustine's City of God became Calvin's predestination of chosenness, and the Puritan Calvinist turned Calvinist chosenness into an American city, Sona Hill. 200 years later, chosenness became part of the American psyche as manifest destiny. By the 1890s, we don't know our history. I didn't know this history till I began teaching history and had to read all of the textbooks and do the research. In the 1890s, manifest destiny, America's belief that it had been chosen became a global belief. It was America's destiny to oversee the islands of the Caribbean, to build the Isthmian Canal, and to dominate the Pacific, as stated by Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahon. That was endorsed by Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt, leading almost immediately to the Spanish-American War and American imperialism. You have there a copy of a famous picture of manifest destiny in the form of a woman leading us in our westward expansion. Go west, young man, go west. There was, however, as we've already spoken of, in man-made cities, the potential for darkness and a dark side. It is embarrassing to talk about this dark side of our so-called chosen city. American success of self-authentication having been gained by being chosen. In 1871, no one less than biologist Charles Darwin took note of the American success and made this startling observation in his book, The Descent of Man. There is apparently much truth in the belief that the wonderful progress of the United States, as well as the character of its people, are the results of natural selection. For the more energetic, restless, and courageous men from all parts of Europe have immigrated during the last 10 or 12 generations to that great country and have there succeeded best. Darwin saying the immigrants to the United States have succeeded the best. Following what I just cited, Darwin immediately quotes a Reverend Mr. Zinke, and he introduces the quotation with the endorsement that he does not believe Zinke is exaggerating when he says that the events leading to the culture of Greece and the Empire of Rome are finally being realized in the great stream of Anglo-Saxon immigration to the West. American scholar John Fiske developed racial corollaries from Darwin by stressing the superior character of Anglo-Saxon institutions and peoples. He said the English race was destined, there's that word, to dominate the globe in the institution, traditions, languages, even in the blood of the world's people. American clergyman Josiah Strong joined the sanction of religion to these theories of racial superiority. Strong argued that Anglo-Saxons embodied two great ideas: civil liberty, that's democracy, and pure spiritual Christianity, that's Protestantism. He believed the Anglo-Saxon was divinely commissioned to be, in a peculiar way, his brother's keeper. By the end of the 19th century, American exceptionalism had become the city on a hill. Manifest Destiny now declared it was the white man's burden, living in his city on a hill, to take care of the rest of the non-white world. American imperialism had been chosen and created to spread democracy and Protestant Christianity to the rest of the non-white globe. White American denominations created foreign mission boards in the 1890s and foreign associations to send white Americans out to take care of the lesser known populations of the world. Songs were written to be sung in congregations in America to incite recruitment fever. There's a sound comes ringing o'er the restless waves. Send the light, America, send the light, you Protestants. There are souls to rescue. There are souls to save. Send the light, send the light. And then you'd sing the chorus, send the light, the blessed gospel light. Let it shine from shore to shore, not just from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but from America's shore all the way to Asian and the Asian shores, across the Pacific to the African shores. Let it shine from shore to shore. Send the light, the blessed gospel light. It was being sung in every Protestant denomination, congregations across the United States. The armies of Army of Manifest Destiny marched onward from the Mexican-American War through the Spanish-American War to the Filipino-American War, where genocide was committed, reminiscent of the Indian Wars and Custer's massacre of the Cheyenne here in Oklahoma on the Washita River. American sensibilities were divided, by the way, over whether or not we should annex the Philippines. President McKinley announced the U.S. policy by stating the United States could not give the Philippines back to Spain or to give them to our economical rivals. He then concluded his speech, "We cannot leave them, the Filipinos, to themselves, for they are unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule worse than Spain's was. So therefore, there is nothing left for us, America, to do but to annex the Philippines and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." Church and state separated. Meanwhile, at home in the United States, while we're sending our armies outward and sending our missionaries outward, having created the city on a hill as a foreign policy to spread democracy and Protestant Christianity around the globe, it now turned to creating a domestic policy within our own backyard. The Industrial Revolution brought millions of non-Western immigrants to the United States after the American Civil War. The very racially inferior peoples that the foreign missionaries were going overseas to save had simultaneously arrived here. The arrogance of Anglo-Saxon superiority dripping from every word, the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty became an open invitation to those unfortunate not to have been born white. Give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send the homeless, the tempest-tossed to me. I will lift up my lamp beside the golden door. The wretched refuse had come in the 1890s, the 1900s. They had come by the millions. Woodrow Wilson, while president of Princeton University, stated the immigrant newcomers of recent years are men of the lowest class, from the south of Italy, and men of the meaner sort of Hungary and Poland, men out of the ranks where there was neither skill nor energy, nor any initiative or quick intelligence. Manifest Destiny embraced the challenge of non-white immigration by creating a domestic version of foreign missionaries known as progressivism and its social gospel. Unlike Judaism and other religions within itself, Christianity possessed no sacred law governing, applicable to all aspects and departments of life. It's invented by Augustine in creating his city, telling people how to live, invented by the social gospel. One of the consequences of Christianity originally not having all of those Jewish laws to live our culture by was that a whole sphere of social order lay outside the direct competence of the church, and hence was a secular world we all lived in until Augustine and the social gospel. This sphere was a ready medium for the growth of a profane philosophical spirit. Augustine's city was a social religion with the social regulation of life based on a mixture of Old Testament legalism and Roman legalism coupled with the imperial code. The Puritan city on a hill was a social dictatorship that had failed, but its belief in chosenness survived as a byproduct by adapting to the changing social culture in which it now found itself. Likewise, under the leadership of Rauschenbusch, Josiah Strong, and others, the Protestant city on a hill, adapting to the changing social culture created by non-Western immigration, created a social gospel for America's social religion. A vital component of the modern city was the invisible component in all Augustinian-derived cities, the autocratic empowerment, embodiment in chosenness. There is no free will in the cities. Chosenness gives the chosen ones autocratic authority to tell others how to live. In the modern city, chosen, in our case, Americans, created programs to tell, to teach, to show others how to live and improve their lives. The modern city was filled with do-gooders because they were chosen and therefore knew best for everyone else, telling, dictating, and requiring everyone else to do things their way, the do-gooders' way. The hidden agenda of the modern city, was the social control of the people, the social control of the personal lives of the people. Non-Western immigrants were from a different culture and civilization with a different history, a different language, and a different religion. Immigrants not only spoke a different language, they spoke a different culture. That is, they didn't speak American. They didn't think and behave like an American. Their presence caused that clash of cultures that we spoke of earlier today. Immigrants, therefore, were a threat here in the United States. American industrial cities were filled with noise, disease, and crime, all attributed to the inferior immigrant. The do-gooder side of Manifest Destiny sought to lessen the threat by creating all manner of social programs and to help immigrants to assimilate, adapt, and adopt American ways of thinking and living. And now we come to probably the saddest chapter in our lives, our own history. There is no joy in talking about any of this. But for those who want to hide and blame all of the other cities' man-made ways of living and not consider all cities, including our own, have become and are ultimately potentially Babylon. We must speak of the city's dirty little secret. In addition to John Fiske and Josiah Strong, others also developed their programs from the biological theories and observations of Charles Darwin. Among them, Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton. In the same way animal breeders sought to breed better stock, Galton invented eugenics that advocated improving the biological quality of the human race by having the best and the fittest humans be the ones to mate. The driving force behind the eugenics movement was the fear within the Anglo-Saxons of the dilution of their whiteness biologically and the dilution of the whiteness of their culture by an inundation of foreign-born immigrants. Not only was America overwhelmed with millions of new immigrants, but the immigrants had a greater fecundity, birth rate, which resulted in a higher birth rate than the old stock population. The positive side of eugenics encouraged the fittest to marry the fittest. It was an effort to keep white America white. A massive national campaign popularized eugenics through America's public schools, sponsoring eugenics Sundays in the churches, even supplying pastors with the sermon for that day, sponsoring booths at county and state fairs, as well as the creation of Hollywood movies. Ivy League universities such as Harvard and Princeton offered courses and degrees teaching eugenics theory. Within a decade, old stock America nationally had been fully indoctrinated into Anglo-Saxon superiority. You will see there in your manual, there is a picture of one of the posters that were readily seen and known across the United States. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of heredity, disease, and unfitness by eugenics. This is not some unknown group at the time. They were nationally known, had their headquarters there at Cold Harbor, New York on Long Island. That was the positive side. The negative side, the darker side to eugenics. Margaret Sanger and others realized that the birth rate among educated white women would never match that of immigrant women. Therefore, she created Planned Parenthood as a means of getting immigrant women, as well as poor white trash, to kill their own babies. It's in her autobiography. Tests were invented identifying defective humans who were sterilized in order to prevent their having defective children. The sterilization of Carrie Buck, one of the most tragic stories of that 17-year-old backwoods girl in Virginia. Her case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Having been raped, she was accused of lewdness and promiscuity. And the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice said 3 generations of imbecility is enough. The stepfather that she was related to was last name Buck. He had a brother also part of that less aristocratic part of Virginia. And from that brother's lineage all the way down to the present, we have a member of St. Elijah whose mother's maiden name was one of the Bucks from Virginia. He is an adjunct professor in the political science department at the university I also teach at. Imbecilities, This is personal, folks. Here in the state of Oklahoma, a man named Jack Skinner stole a chicken when he was 17, got arrested 2 times later on doing something, and his punishment was to be sterilized as a perpetual criminal. Went all the way to the United States Supreme Court before it blocked Oklahoma from sterilizing him as punishment. Laws were passed forbidding the intermarriage of whites and non-whites. If you haven't seen or know the story of Loving versus the state of Virginia, I urge you to acquaint yourself with that story. Finally, in 1924, with the leaders of the American eugenics movement from the Eugenics Records Office, ERO, at Cold Harbor, New York, being the lead people speaking advocates at the congressional hearings on an American immigration policy. Based on their testimony in 1924, the United States passed restrictive immigration, in effect closing American borders to all non-white immigration. Our borders would stay closed until 1964. You have there in your manual a picture of the cover of the Third International Congress of Eugenics held in New York City in 1932. The picture I found has a black cover. When I ordered my own copy, it came out in a white copy. The American eugenics movement. And now, the worst secret of all. The secret within our dirty little secret. Babylon. Buried deep within the hidden by omission awareness of the American eugenics movement. We've never heard of it. We don't know we did this. And propagandized an entire country in 1900, 1910, and 1920. Buried deep within this, never heard of it, is the dirtiest little secret of all. It was the American eugenist who taught the German Nazis how to do it. The Nazi Holocaust was the outgrowth of American eugenics movement. Harry L. McLaughlin was a major leader. He's the one that testified before Congress on our 1924 immigration bill, headquartered, I believe, also at the Eugenics Records Office at Cold Harbor in New York. His name appeared on the report I just held up of the Third International Congress of Eugenics that was held in New York City in 1932. In recognition of his important contributions to that field, Laughlin received an honorary degree from the University of Heidelberg in Nazi Germany in 1936. You will find there in your manual a picture of his degree from Heidelberg. You perhaps will be able to at least read the word Heidelberg on the second printed line from the bottom. Heidelberg, May 1936. It's in the American Files of Truman University. Wow. By the way, the German scholars are now beginning to research this entire connection of the Holocaust this way. And most recently, a German scholar has published The Nazi Connection, Eugenics, American Racism, and German National Socialism by Stephen Kuhl, winner of the Frankel Prize for Contemporary History, published by Oxford University Press. This is not junk stuff. This is legitimate historical evidence. I've got to hurry. In 1965, 11 years after the United States Congress inserted President Eisenhower signed into law on Flag Day, June 14th, 1954, where we added the phrase, "under God," into the Pledge of Allegiance, Harvey Cox, Hollis Research Professor of Divinity at Harvard University, published his book, The Secular City. We started with Augustine City. We've come to the United States with the city on a hill, and now still in the United States, we're seeing that city now become the secular city. We're looking at city and why we need a new city by the grace of God. The secular city, in which Cox defined secularization as the liberation of man from religious and metaphysical tutelage, the turning of his attention away from other worlds and towards this one, the empirical. Cox's opening words signaled that one nation under God might be only words. The rise of urban civilization, I'm quoting, and the collapse of traditional religion are the two main hallmarks of our era. Remember, what age are we in? The partial truth of each age. Cox argued a change in the way men grasp and understand their life together. That change has occurred when the cosmopolitan world cities confrontations of city living, cosmopolitan, people from different cultures, different historical backgrounds, nationalities, languages, the cosmopolitan world of city living exposed the relativity of the myths and traditions that men once thought were unquestionable. Everything is now questionable in 1965. Augustine City and its Puritan and American city on a hill, the offspring, had been laid out to reflect the pattern of a heavenly city, the abode of the gods, and once laid out, their vision, the pattern of the polis, the city, influenced the ways in which succeeding generations in that country experienced life and visualized the gods. That city was now gone. Although the pledge now declared we were one nation under God, standing against the godless communists of the Cold War, without anyone noticing, Augustine's city in the United States had been replaced in our day, in the 60s. The secular metropolis stands as both the new pattern of our life together and the symbol of It did now. It's back on. See, you want it? No, it's blinking red.
I apologize.
No. Crucify me. I'll go back up and you can edit it. How's that? I know where I was. Tell me when. Okay, we just lost our audio. We'll hopefully back on. In our day, in the 60s and since, the secular metropolis stands as both the pattern of our life together and the symbol of our new view of the world. We have swapped one version of Babylon for a new version. For more than 50 years since the publication of the secular city, the overthrow of the Augustinian city with its way of thinking and living has been taking place one cultural revolution in the United States at a time. The 60s, the sexual revolution, followed by the feminist revolution. We've had the now digital revolution, followed by a gender revolution, each defining a new way of thinking and a different way and lifestyle of living, of organizing our collective life together. The building of the secular city began after World War II. The ethos of the Cold War believed any social conflict along racial, class, and gender lines within American society would harm our image abroad, would strengthen our enemy, the Soviet Union, would weaken us as a nation, making us vulnerable to communism. Many believed racial strife, emancipated women, class conflict, and familial disruption posed the greatest danger to the United States. Racially, after World War II, second-generation European immigrants moved out of their ethnic neighborhoods in the cities, leaving their kinship networks along with their outsider status behind. Post-war prosperity and the promise of assimilation made it possible for ethnic Americans to blend into the homogeneous suburbs. Jews and Catholics joined Anglo-Saxon Protestants in these all-white communities, even if they could not join their country clubs or their social gatherings. Jewish comedian Groucho Marx famously said, "I would not be a member of any club that would have me as a member." With all-white neighborhoods welcoming ethnic Americans, Manifest Destiny now deemed ethnic Americans to be white and accepted Jews and Catholics. By the time Harvey Cox wrote The Secular City, the inclusion was done. Now, people of color remained excluded from the suburban communities and were denied the benefits of American prosperity, even if they could afford it. The Civil Rights Movement would lead to the passing of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 100 years after the American Civil War, and almost 90 years after Reconstruction ended. In 1966, Betty Friedan founded NOW, National Organization of Women, and the feminist movement challenged the cult of domesticity that had been created by our government during the Cold War. The cult of domesticity had made it one's patriotic duty to get married, stay married, and have multiple children. It had also led to the singular phenomenon of there being a baby boom. It never happened after any other war before or since. Single men, single women, including divorced women, were now deemed unpatriotic during the McCarthy era and were seen as prime suspects of being communist spies. Non-heterosexuals went into the closet, married and had children as a defense against being judged unpatriotic. 75 years after World War II ended, the cult of domesticity and its template of the nuclear family is today a vague memory. The secular city has created its new identity. The social identity of manifest destiny may have changed. The arrogance of chosenness, telling others how to live their lives, has not changed. In terms of the paradigm dynamic, all cities are man-made cities. The difference between pagan cities, religious cities, secular cities, and scientific cities is who the chosen ones are. Who the self-chosen ones who tell everyone else how to live. Those who want to fight a cultural battle over a changing cultural definition, those who are wanting to fight a battle between an Augustinian or a Puritan city versus a secular city, are fighting a battle inside Babylon over which Babylonian city you want. You're not talking about stepping outside Babylon and beginning to consider the new city, the city of Jerusalem. I'm now ready for the conclusion. Someone just went, thank God. Babylon, the city of man. Genesis 11:4. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they will do. Nothing that they will purpose to do will now be held with them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building that city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Every man-made city, including, and ought I say especially, those built in the name of the builder's God, remains a man-made city, regardless of how well intended its intentions. The difference between cities are matters of preference. What one deems good, another deems evil. Still speaking metaphorically. Having said no to life with the Creator in His paradise, His world, mankind set out to build its own paradise, a city whose name makes known the identity of its builders, the way Paris, Rome, London, Berlin, Moscow, Washington, Los Angeles, each with a different identity, a different esprit, and an attitude towards life, as different as New York from Los Angeles, and as different as Sydney from Perth. Howsoever, no matter how different each city is, each of these cities shares a common identity of Babel, the man-made city. Babylon is the identity of all cities built by man to be a man-made city, a godless city, a city of man. God's judgment on Babylon, includes His judgment on all cities, since all cities are included with the name Babylon. God's judgment on Babylon in Genesis 11 and in the Apocalypse is the judgment on mankind's godless world, no matter our best intentions and best efforts. A world that reveals its godless identity most clearly in its cities. This is the first judgment and the last judgment of mankind's self-created world. He who is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, is the Alpha and Omega, judging the failure of Babylon, the failure of all little Babylons, their failure to give life. Cities have a common language, a common mind, a common esprit. There is only one voice to which they all lend their voice. The cadence of their voice is the cadence of their lives. Every aspect within the life of a city, every aspect of the public life of the people, and the aspect of the private lives of the people are harmoniously singing one song, the name of the city, in the language of that city. Chicago. I'm not making fun of Chicago, and I'm not spinning them out. My kind of town. It's our culture, our patriotic hymns that we sing, etc., etc. A humanity capable of communicating has in its possession the most terrible weapon of its own death. It is capable, we are capable of creating a unique truth believed by all within our group, a truth independent of God. Mud bricks built the ziggurat towers of Mesopotamia and Babylon. Carnegie steel scraped the skies of New York and Chicago. Today's internet and smartphones make possible the global city, the cosmopolitan city. Babylon the Great, one city, one language, one truth for the whole world. But one man's truth is another man's lie. No matter how loudly the global city, Babylon, shouts its truth, no matter how loudly one political party shouts its truth and the other replies with its truth, man-made truth is always partial and eventually contested. The ruins of Babylon, its cities and its empires, are scattered across human history. It is not the city of man, whether a religious city or a secular city, that abides and remains. Left standing is the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Well, I apologize for the length, but I hope that you now see, generically speaking, in a fallen world, we can only build fallen ways to live together. That's how we live. We are not at war against the world in which we live. But there is an alternative, a different way of living, and we are now going to spend our next chapters towards the conclusion to our study of the Apocalypse, headed towards the New Jerusalem. We're going to see what happens as we examine the life of Abraham, starting next time. God willing, I'll see you then. Thank you.